bioethics,
law, euthanasia,
consumerism,
politics, terrorism,
globalization,
religion,
migrant population,
interfaith, drug addiction.
His legacy not only lingers on, it gallops on. That's the most surprising thing. And it does so not only in his own country, but across the Atlantic in the United States, other parts of the New World, Australia, Canada, South Africa. It gallops away in Asia, which would have been completely surprising to him, parts of Europe and so on. Why this continuing legacy so long after his death? And then in what ways does it provide a continuing challenge to us? Because, as I want to say, we still have things to learn from him 2 generations after he has died. There are still some things which he said and did which we have not fully appreciated, and for that reason suffer to some extent as a result. But first, the legacy. There are several ways in which Lewis's work lives on, and although he himself wrote in different genres, I think he would also have been somewhat amazed to find the varieties of ways, the varieties of forms in which his influence continues to affect so many people today. It's hard to estimate how many of his books have been published, but it's probably somewhere near 200 million. And they grow every year. They're published in at least 17 different languages, and that number continues to expand each year. Languages in all parts of the world. Books like Mere Christianity remain central to people's reading, as does the Screwtape Letters, and of course the Chronicles of Narnia. So his writings, certainly, we're having a little problem here getting the levels right, but we'll get there eventually. His writings were also available on audio cassette. His writings are also available on audio cassette, MP4, just nod if you need it a little louder. A second way in which Lewis's influence continues is through visual media and through various radio, stage, TV programs. The Chronicles of Narnia appeared back in the 1980s on English TV. At least 4 of them did, to considerable effect. The BBC screened the play Shadowlands. Before it was even a play, it was just a film script. Also around that time, to popular acclaim, it became a play which played not only in the West End but many other parts of the world. It was then filmed as a feature film with Anthony Hopkins and Deborah Winger by Richard Attenborough, and was hugely popular around the world. The Chronicles of Narnia, of course, has now been filmed again, this time as major Hollywood productions. 3 of the films have appeared. Others are yet to come. The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, when it appeared, was the 25th most popular film ever made. Ever made. Prince Caspian did not do quite so well, nor did The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, but did exceedingly well also. In pre-production now is the 4th of the series, The Silver Chair, and Walden Media, who owns the franchise, hopes to make all 7 films in time. A third way in which Lewis's work continues to gain influence is through other kinds of productions. I mentioned the play Shadowlands. There's also, and it's been performed here in Singapore, maybe some of you have seen it, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, which is also partly a musical. geared for not only children but for adults of all persuasions. It's been shown in many parts of the world. Just last year or the year before in America, Freud's last session, thank you, came on Broadway as a play. It's now touring various parts of the world to great success. This is based on an alleged possible meeting between C.S. Lewis and Sigmund Freud during the last month of Freud's life in London. We know that Freud was there. We know that he met an academic from Oxford where they talked about a range of things to do with religion, philosophy, and psychology. Nobody knows who it was, but the author of the play suggests it may have been C.S. Lewis. A fourth way in which Lewis's influence continues to live on is different again. He's been recognised most recently in the way in which he would have appreciated most of all, but never happened much during his life, that is as a poet. He wrote much in his youth, and he continued to write in his midlife and later years, and some of his poems have become more widely known in his own native Ireland. He has now for the first time been included in an anthology of significant Irish poets. He's buried in Poets' Corner, as I mentioned, in Westminster Abbey. And he's now coming into his own as at least one of the main minor poets of the United Kingdom in the earlier part of the last century. Another way in which Lewis's work continues to influence people is through his academic writings. These are less known to ordinary readers. But Lewis made his name as an academic before he did anything else, and his seminal book, English Literature, in the 16th century was, until not so long ago, the standard text on the whole period, and is still regarded as one of the landmark contributions over the last 100 years. He wrote other significant books on particularly medieval literature and post-medieval literature, which are still published and widely read, such as The Allegory of Love, The Discarded Image, books you may not have heard of, but are significant to those in the Academy. His little book, An Experiment in Criticism, which sounds rather arcane, actually, many years before it became a trendy and an accepted way of doing literary criticism, showed that the reader is an important part of the process in receiving, interpreting, understanding, and continuing the legacy of writings. And Lewis's particular contribution is to say that the ordinary reader, not just the elite academic reader or the literary critic, has a vital role to play here. I'll say more about the ordinary person later. Another way in which Lewis lives on is simply through his quotations. I want to mention a few just to remind you of what some of them were. But in a survey taken only a few years ago in the United States, they were attempting to find out who were the most influential public intellectuals in the last 50 years to 100 years in the American context. The survey that was conducted looked at how many times these people were quoted, referred to in public discussions of a whole range of issues. Despite his not being an American, despite his never being to America, Lewis was the 20th most quoted public intellectual in America's last century-long history. Quite a remarkable achievement. In fact, he's quite possibly the most quoted Christian writer, apart perhaps from Augustine, Aquinas, Luther, and Calvin, since Jesus and Paul, right up until the 20th century. And finally, thinking about his legacy, people whom he influenced who went on to make significant contributions themselves. I want to just mention a few of them. Some you'll have heard of, some you won't. Go with those that are known to you. People whom he helped bring to faith or whose faith he significantly changed in the biblical direction include the philosopher C.E.M. Joad, the influential lay Christian writer Elton Trueblood, the evangelical theologian J.I. Packer, the Bible translator J.B. Phillips, the popular Christian writer Philip Yancey, the children's highly popular fantasy writer J.K. Rowland. I've got some Australians here, but I'll leave them out. You won't have heard of them. The well-known pastor and writer Tim Keller. The Catholic philosopher, very well known and received, Peter Kreeft. Billy Graham's successor, Leighton Ford. The Anglican Archbishop of England, the United Kingdom, who's just resigned, Rowan Williams. The prize-winning author, Annie Rice. The theological writer, Alistair McGrath, etc. These are just some of the people who Lewis has influenced either in very basic or at least highly influential ways. And that's not to speak of the wide range, the thousands upon thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of ordinary people who have drawn sustenance from Lewis, not only at a particular point in their lives, but sometimes right throughout their lives. Some of you, no doubt, right here. My own country, I would say, put your hand up if you've been influenced significantly by Lewis, but I won't do it here because it might be embarrassing. Lewis influenced believers and unbelievers. He influenced adults, teenagers, and children. He influenced people from the Western tradition as well as people from Asian, African, European, and Latin American traditions. Extraordinary for one person to do all this, and remarkable that it should continue still to happen even today. If I can just add a footnote to saying that 200 million of his books have been now published throughout the world, more of Lewis's books are published each year than the year before. Every year, the number of people who buy his books continues to increase. Maybe that will stop at some point, but it's certainly far from happening yet. You only have to go into Kinokuniya here in Singapore. I can remember the first time I walked into Borders in Singapore and it was still here to see a whole shelf of books by C.S. Lewis there ready to be bought. They would not be in these stores if people were not still reading them. So why? Why this ongoing influence? There have been many other Christian writers since, academics, children's writers, apologists, theologians, essayists, all the fields which Lewis delved into. Why does influence still continue, and why, as I want to suggest, are there still things we can learn from him? The first reason I'd suggest that this is the case is that Lewis, in a way that was quite exemplary, focused on essential, central things and was able to put secondary things to one side. He did this when he wrote about Christianity, and he did it when he wrote about other areas of life than the centrally Christian one. So, for example, although he was an Anglican, here we are in an Anglican setting now, very appropriate for Lewis, he'd be, I think, quite pleased, that he was able to avoid denominational particularities and other secondary theological matters. It's not that he wasn't interested in some of these, or that he didn't now and again make a comment about them, but he pushed them to the sidelines in order to focus on what he called mere Christianity. Simple Christianity, basic Christianity, to use a title from one of John Stott's books. What most Christians in most places, in most times, have believed as central to their faith. For him, this included the reality of God as creator, revealer, redeemer. It included the fallenness of human nature and also its potential grandeur. It included the centrality of Christ, not only as teacher, but his salvific death and his physical resurrection. It included the importance of obedience and sanctification at the personal and practical, in the inward but also in the outward part of our lives. And it included a deep certainty in the prospect, the coming reality of the life to come. As Lewis says in the film Shadowlands, in one of the little pieces of conversation, in a way, all my writings have been about heaven. But moving away from beliefs to practices, Lewis also focused on central Christian practices when he wrote about the Christian life, not ones that were there on the margins. And therefore he concentrated on Christian behaviour, that's there in Mere Christianity, and is central to his book on the Four Loves, amongst others. He focused on the daily fact of temptation, Screwtape Letters. He focused on prayer, what it was and what it wasn't, Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer. He focused on Scripture, not only, but certainly in his little book on Reflections on the Psalms, but then Scripture is something that saturates the whole of C.S. Lewis's writings. I don't know whether you knew it, but Lewis read the whole Bible every year, closely, attentively, devotionally, thoughtfully. And Lewis wrote about friendship, which he regarded as one of the key ways in which God changed people's lives, and certainly it was true of his own. But Lewis didn't just concentrate on central things when he was writing about the Christian faith or the Christian life. When he concentrated on objections to Christianity, he did the same thing. He looked for the ones that were the most important, moral, psychological, scientific, philosophical, etc., and went on to critique some of the key tendencies of the modern age, things which he regarded as threatening to everyone, but to Christians as well as others. He listed some of these as the tendency towards subjectivism, rather than recognising that there was an objective reality out there. The tendency towards relativism, rather than believing there were certain things which were absolutes. The tendency to believe that progress was something that would continue to enhance life for everybody, as opposed to a more realistic assessment of human development. The tendency towards totalitarianism, which cropped up both in Russia and in Germany in his own lifetime, at the expense of people's personal, social and political freedom. The tendency towards materialism as opposed to ongoing belief in some kind of supernatural dimension to our existence. Lewis, particularly in his essays, but also at times in his writings, also addressed some of the significant moral and social problems of his day. It wasn't his main concern. He often mixed it with what he was doing to try and get people to realise the claims of the Christian faith. That was part of his apologetics, but it was something that he certainly did. It fits very closely with what Ethos is doing in its public Christianity program. And so he wrote on the legitimacy of war, a little essay, Why I'm Not a Pacifist. On the purpose of punishment, was it basically retributive or was it to rehabilitate people? He wrote on the growing dominance of technology. In fact, his inaugural Cambridge lecture said this was one of the defining marks not only of the modern age, but of everything that has happened in the last 2,000 years or more. He was one of the prescient people to recognise that as early as the 1950s. He wrote about the ambiguity of national declarations. The English were fond of doing this every so often in their recent history, sometimes with regard to educational aspirations, sometimes with regard to even repentance for certain things that had happened, but he felt that these were much more ambiguous than often seemed to be the case. And Lewis lived long enough even to write on what it was to live in an atomic age. All of these things are still, in one way or another, certainly with us. What can we learn from this? Well, what we can learn, in a sense, is quite obvious, that we need people, and we ourselves, in context with other Christians and with others who are not Christian, need also to focus on what is central, whether it's to do with our faith, our practices, objections to the Christian faith, or issues which are out there in the public square. Too often we get caught up with secondary matters, with arguing the toss about things which may matter in a small way but certainly don't matter in any significant way. Lewis was not only able to focus in on what was central to Christianity, both as a belief system and as a way of life, but he was able to focus in on what was central to the beliefs of those who had opposite points of view to the Christian ones. He could frequently expound an alternative point of view more persuasively and more credibly than its best exponents. He knew it so well from the inside, and he knew what lay at the heart of such a set of beliefs. Too often we add things to what is central, and that mixes up our conversations and makes them less effective than they should be. Of course, there are parts of the church too which take too much away and don't stress sufficiently, insistently, the things which really matter the most. I call it gospel plus and gospel minus. Both miss the point and don't keep the conversation on track with the things that matter most, the things that actually made the most significant difference. That's the first point I would make about Lewis's reason for continuing as a significant influence, but also something that many of us have still not sufficiently learned, and to our disadvantage has that happened. Secondly, the most important way of conveying the Christian faith is to do it in a way that is thoughtful but also witty. That might sound like a strange combination to put together, but it's something which Lewis believed was important. I say a little bit extra about what I began to say a moment ago. When Lewis took an alternative point of view to the Christian one, he was able, and here he followed somebody whom he regarded highly, Augustine, to expound that position, as I've said, in a way that was sometimes better than those who were its chief exponents. But beyond that, having done that, he was able then to critique it, not by stepping back and saying, let me tell you Christianly what's wrong with this position that you're holding, but to take what was at the very heart of the logic of this alternative position and follow it through to its own end, to show that the very heart, the very base of this alternative position had something inside it which was inadequate, and if you just kept on following it through, it began to throw up problems or even contradict the very position out of which it flowed. He never belittled other positions. He never spoke down to them, partly because he himself had passed through different phases in his own life where he held some of these alternative options to Christianity. He knew what they were like from the inside, and he knew their seductive power, and he knew that they had power, that they were appealing, that they were attractive, that you could get caught up in them for a time and think that they were what life was all about. So he would never put them down. He would simply help people to see them as they really were. It's something we're not all that good at often as Christians. We're much more interested in simply standing to one side and sheeting home things that we think are not fully adequate about others' positions. He was able to take people with him and then began to help them to think from within their own position towards his position. But he did that not just in a sober fashion. Lewis, as we know, had a sense of humour. And it often came to the fore, not only in his conversations, but it came to the fore in his writings as well. One of the things about humour, which brings it close to Christianity, is it's able to turn things on its head. It's able to see things from the down up instead of just from the up down, from the inside out instead of just from the outside in. And it's able to do it in a way which is arresting, which is fresh, which makes you laugh or wince, as the case might happen. Lewis does this frequently in his writings. He'll be arguing a certain point of view, and then he'll just throw in something which is not comic relief, but it's a very witty insight which makes even the reader who is being critiqued laugh before they even realise what they're laughing at, that they're laughing at their own position. You have to, I was going to say be clever. It's not so much being clever, it's being able to see right inside something to be able to do that. At times Lewis wrote a whole book which was nothing more than one extended witty joke, the Screwtape Letters. It's really just one joke that goes on for 120 pages, sustained by an extraordinary imagination and a wonderful perception of the very everyday, ordinary, mundane nature of the temptations that come our way and how easily we can just be caught up in them without even knowing that they're at all going to do us harm. Lewis, of course, was not the first to do this. G.K. Chesterton, one of his mentors, had done it 20 to 30 years before in the United Kingdom. Some of the significant apologists down through Christian history had been able to do bits of it at times as well. And it goes way back to the Jewish prophets in the 8th century, Isaiah and Ezekiel and others, who talk about idolatry in ways which point out how ludicrous it actually is, how extraordinarily off-centre and funny when you look at it the whole thing is. People propping up idols and jostling them around, these poor things swaying to and fro, and they can't open their mouths, their ears can't hear anything, and they're expected to somehow speak and change lives and make revolutionary transformation in the worshippers, their devotees around them. The prophets saw that you had to satirize these in a serious way in order to properly do injustice or justice to them. And Lewis very much wrote from that kind of position. So this fascinating combination of thoughtfulness and wittiness is something which marks Lewis's writings. I have a friend, I haven't seen him for some years now. He was something of a street evangelist, I suppose. I don't mean standing up on street corners, but he was able to open up a conversation with almost anybody about almost anything, and somehow within 3 or 4 minutes they were talking about things that really mattered. Without changing or bending or manipulating the conversation. It's just something he had learned to do and perhaps had been a little gifted to do. And he showed me his Bible once, and because he often used to open the Bible and point to different verses as he was talking with people. And at the back of his Bible he had a whole set of jokes. And in the course of his conversations with ordinary people, every so often he'd flip open to the back and he'd say, yeah, that'd be a good joke right here. This is the one that fits the current conversation, and he'd tell a joke. So it was a strange way of doing it, one I couldn't do, one that wouldn't work with everybody. And some people would think it was somehow not very sacred to have a bunch of jokes at the back of your holy book. But for him, he understood something of what Lewis was about, that these two went closely together, as they should for us.